questions. So thank you so much for joining us today. This session is hosted by the Division for Learning Disabilities, DLD of CEC. And this webinar is called Improving Accessibility of Your Research Communication. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about what the session's going to involve. Casey will do that. But we're really excited to be able to offer this. And I'm excited to learn more about how to improve accessibility in all of the things that I share. So before we dive into the session, just a couple of quick notes. If you're interested, if you could go back to the other one for a sec, sorry, Casey, thanks. If you're interested in supporting DLD further, we encourage you to join. So when you join CEC with your renew your membership, you just select DLD as a division of interest. And then you can also follow us on Twitter at TeachingLD, online at teachingld.org. And if you have any questions about accessing this session or how to get involved in DLD, you are welcome to email me. I'm the Vice President of DLD at jrtost@austin.utexas.edu. And now are the quick notes. I said it too quickly before. So a few things before we get started. This session is being recorded, as you probably saw in our advertising and the confirmation for the session. We're going to make the webinar available online later, so it is being recorded. You will only be recorded on your video if you speak aloud. So if you stay quiet, you will be fine. You're welcome to keep your video on. The live transcript is enabled. So actually, I just enabled it. So if you want to have transcription during the session, you just need to click live transcript at the bottom of your Zoom. And then we will also take questions throughout the webinar and at the end. So whenever you have them, if you have questions, you're welcome to just put them in the chat. If you have something you really want to ask aloud to, you can raise your hand and get one of our attention as we go. So without further ado, I will introduce our guest today. So Dr. Casey Boyle is the director of the Digital Writing and Research Lab at the University of Texas at Austin. And he's also an associate professor in the Department of Rhetoric and Writing. And so I'm really excited to have him here today for this workshop to teach us more about how to think of accessibility in all of the materials that we share. And I will turn it over. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. And thanks to Division of Learning Disabilities of CEC for having me here and for putting this on. A little bit more about me. I am, like I said, like Jessica said, I'm Casey Boyle. I'm here at University of Texas. I teach a lot of classes in accessibility and accessible media. And I run a lab whose one of our research areas and research focuses is accessible technologies. And so, so the session today is going to be about some of the basic but habitual things that we want to do to make our writing and communication a lot more accessible. Let me see if I can get there we go. When we think about accessibility, one of the things we immediately think of is architectural accessibility, things like curb cuts. For instance, in this image, we have a curb that's hard to navigate with a chair or with any other wheel device. And so we come up with things like workarounds to make them better, right? Make them more accessible. So it's super easy to create a curb cut that will allow for more access to, in this case, a sidewalk or a street. But despite our best intentions, sometimes even the curb cut doesn't do enough. Sometimes a curb cut doesn't quite get at all of the obstacles to access. For instance, we have things like this. This is actually a place in the world that they have a curb cut in front of a telephone pole. So even if the best intentions was to create access, the structural situation disallowed it. The reason why I wanted to start off with that today, and I'll talk a little bit more about accessibility and disability in a second, is because we often think about disability as, and I'm talking to scholars and teachers of learning disabilities, so I don't have to go on too much about what I would normally go on in these sessions. But I want to have a quick 4 or 5 minutes talk about how to orient ourselves towards creating accessible documents. After that, quick orientation, I want to go through and look at some nuts and bolts of actual platforms. So how do we make documents, Word docs and Google Docs more accessible? How do we make PDFs more accessible? How do we make images more accessible? And then further, how do we make accessibility part and parcel of our social media use as well? In each of those, I have a short, quick little exercise that we'll do. And I don't expect this, and I don't intend this at all to be a lecture. I'm probably going to be talking the most, obviously, but please definitely like interrupt or ask questions or just make a comment at any point if you want to. You can do so in the chat or just speak up. You're more than welcome to interrupt me, and we can carry this on as a conversation or as like a real kind of workshop. So I'll just get started there. So here's the big takeaways for today's session. Disability is the result of a mismatch between a person and her environment. This means that disability isn't a person's problem, right? This could be the curb cut we just saw, but most often for our cases, it's going to be documents that we write and compose and share. Disability occurs when those documents cannot be accessed for whatever reason. All documents, even those that have only text, need to be made accessible. And I'll talk about a little bit about why that is in a second. Accessibility refers not only to the content, as in, is that file accessible to me, right? But also in how that content is presented and formatted. And again, we're as consumers of programs like Microsoft Word or Google Docs, there's a lot of back-end formatting that gets hidden from us to increase so-called usability of a platform, while it might also decrease the accessibility of that same document you're creating. And then finally, and this is going with the curb cut example, accessibility makes things better for everyone. And I will talk a little bit about that as we go through. So disability and accessibility, a couple of basic principles before we jump into the platforms. As you all know, are well familiar, the medical model of disability views disability as something wrong with the individual. You all know this from your own work and early on in your own work, I'm sure. Whereas the social model of disability understands disability as something wrong with the environment or the documents from which we are working. This is important to think about in terms of design, because even if someone is designing or writing or building something to be made accessible, even though they understand that the built environment or the written document is what creates disability, it's still tough for those designers and writers to not consider the individual when they're doing so. So for instance, a good book, I think this is like a great book. I'm not sure if you're not familiar with it, I would highly suggest it. It's great at the undergraduate level. It's great all the way through. It's by Kat Holmes. It's called Mismatch, and it's talking about how inclusive design, how inclusion shapes design. In this one chapter, though, There Was No Normal, and I'm gonna come back to this a couple more times. There's no normal. She goes on at length about the bell curve and the way that products are designed and mass production, and how there's this sort of like normal that gets engineered and imposed on everybody else, right? And one of the ways that designers and writers have thought to respond to that problem of imposing this normal thing is to start thinking about personas when they design for people. And so they'll think of someone, for instance, with one arm as a permanent disability. And even though they're trying to create an equitable and accessible environment, they're still, in a way, imposing this medical model. How do I fix this for this one person, right? And what Holmes gives us is an idea, instead of thinking about a persona spectrum. Whereas if you're designing an object or a document or building, not to think about a person with one arm as if you're trying to solve their problem in the world, right? But to think about how disability itself is along a spectrum. It can be permanent in terms of the one arm situation. It could be a temporary disability with, for instance, broken arm. It could be a situational, new parent or carrying groceries or something along those lines, right? And another thing that's really great about this book, anyways, is it talks about our notion of notion of normality and ability as that always being somewhat temporary. Is like, ability and the idea that someone is able-bodied or whatnot, that's such a temporary state. And you've come from and you will go into, even if you get to enjoy that like able-bodiedness, that's only a temporary state before something else will happen. So a lot of these are like that. And she goes on to talk about different kinds of persona spectrums. So when we're thinking about writing, one thing we can think about is it's not just to make our communication accessible to someone who's blind or someone who is deaf, but also what about someone who can't listen to a podcast because of where they're at, right? Some sort of situational access problem. So by thinking about not just trying to satisfy one person's access, but thinking through all of the different spectrums of situational, temporary, and permanent access points, we can design better and more accessible communications. Again, highly suggest this book. I don't have any royalties coming to me from this, but I assign it in like 3 different classes, so I probably should. So again, just to repeat, disability is not a personal health condition. It is a mismatched, it's an effect of being mismatched human interactions, whether or not it's a building, a document, a service, teaching, it's about that mismatch. And I think that's a really good way to think about it, because a lot of times, especially for us anyways, accessibility becomes a sort of moral imperative, which is good. And we want that. We want to be ethical. We want to be moral, but we often feel too scared to do it wrong, and instead just to think that, no, this is just, we've got to just try to play this matching game, right? And so it's nothing wrong with getting it wrong, as long as you keep trying and trying to match it up. All right, so here's that's the quick part. I think about, and I wanted to center the idea of design and writing as a kind of design in there, because I think whenever you're trying to create something for someone else to share and to access and for communication even, you are a designer. You're creating a site in which someone can either be included into or excluded from. So to think like a designer and to think through those kinds of personas, I think is really important to have it at least as a start. So general principles. First platform is the Google Doc. We're pretty familiar with this. I'm old enough to remember, just barely though, I'm old enough to remember when Word documents or Word platforms and Word processing software wasn't this easy. This is the platform we have here is called What You See Is What You Get, WYSIWYG editing. And basically what this is when Word processing first came out, it had a lot of, you had to do a lot of code. You had to, encode it. You had to tell the computer what it was. And over time, in order to increase the usability of this, so that way anybody could use it, they backgrounded all of those functions and features. So that way you could just jump on here and start typing and press print and get exactly what you see here, right? And so by increasing the usability, later it decreases the accessibility. And let me show you a little bit about what's going on behind the scenes of Word docs. So this is something called Markdown. And a number of people use Markdown. I'm not sure if there's any LaTeX. There's another platform called LaTeX, which is a Markdown kind of platform. But if you look on the left, the image on the left, that is how you identify what something is. So the title, it's got to be in quotes and it's be like that. And if you look on the right, that's how it gets translated into a WYSIWYG editor, right? If you hit output, HTML document, it shows there. This is what italics look like, and that's how italics. So, single italics would be the single asterisk, bold would be double, code, so as you see on the other side, it gets translated in there. Now, when you're on a regular Word document and you're just typing in your stuff, you're not going to have all this right away, because what we get right away and what Microsoft wants to give us, or what Google wants to give us, is what normal text, right? It has on the drop-down box, normal. And again, there's no normal here, right? It's still making a choice. And the choice it's making there is saying, this text is body text, this is whatever. And if you're anything like me, or like I used to be a few years ago, whenever I would write a document, at the end, what would you do to like show the title or show subtitles or, do a list? You'd probably just highlight the first line of text and then press bold and then go to the font size and just bump it up a lot more from what the other text was, and voila, there's your title. But the problem with that is, in terms of the encoding, like we see on the left here, it doesn't tell a screen reader or any other sort of assistive technology that is a title. Visually, we can kind of see it as a title, but through the architecture of the text itself, the encoding of it, it doesn't recognize itself as a title whatsoever. So what we want to do is try to figure out how to take the usability that we've been given and increase the accessibility of what we put out. So Sarah Horton and Whitney Quisenberry in this book, Web for Everyone, has a great quote I like to draw upon in situations like this. Like usability, accessibility is a quality. In this case, it means how easily and effective a product or service can be accessed and used. Physical and cognitive ability occur along a spectrum. Everyone has a limit as to what they can physically accomplish and intellectually comprehend. Good accessibility is designed for the full range of those capabilities, as well as for the context of use or environmental constraints. So this is Horton and Quisenberry kind of echoing that same visual document we saw before with the persona spectrums. Environmental constraints, context of use, all of these things go into creating those mismatches or those matches that we saw before. So there's a few things that we want to think about when we think about trying to make documents accessible. First and foremost, is the document clear and concise? Is the content clear and concise? This is basic writing practice that we tell ourselves, we tell our students, we tell our coworkers, hey, can you make this more clear? Can we make this more concise? It's too wordy or something like that. This is really important for accessibility, in that the more verbose something is, the longer it is, the way that it gets accessed by, let's say, a screen reader, it's temporal, and they can speed it up. But if you're reading a text visually, we allow for, and we have a much higher tolerance of longer content, because we can kind of visually see it and ascertain it. But if you're waiting on someone or something to read it to you, it becomes a little bit more difficult to have long-winded content like I'm doing right here. Headings and document structure. These things have to be identified, and I'll go through and show in a second visually, but then also by the platform itself. Hyperlinks, of course, these you want to make sure that they're clearly defined as to where you're pointing someone to. Bullets and lists, again, that's just like headings. These should be formatted. They shouldn't just be like an asterisk and then space, whatever. Color contrast should be high. Image alt text should be filled out, and captions for any video or content. In the workshop today, these are the ones we're going to be looking at. Just talk a second about clear and concise content, talk a little bit more about headings and document structure, a little bit about bullets and lists, and then we'll talk a little bit also about image and alt texts. And I've got a couple of exercises throughout here for us to do, just like quick exercises to go through and talk about. All right, so in terms of clear and concise, a lot of this is somewhat self-explanatory, but some can, but it's always a good refresh. So simple language and formatting as appropriate to the context. So short, clear sentences and paragraphs, unnecessarily complex or jargon words are easy. These are also screen readers have difficulty reading like some kinds of jargon. Expand acronyms on first use. So for instance, web content accessibility guidelines, and then ever after you can use the regular. Same kinds of things we do for regular writing are really still important for accessible writing as well. So use list formatting wherever appropriate. Again, this is in an analogy to the curb cut being good for everyone. Lists and these kinds of formatting is good for everyone. So even someone who's a sighted reader and who's reading the text, breaking up the text from big, thick, kind of dense paragraphs into lists and negative space is really helpful for understanding and retention. And then finally, consider using images, illustrations, video, and audio to help clarify meaning. And a lot of these can be found and more at Writing for Web Accessibility, that website right there. Let me give you an example. So on the left, we have unnecessarily complex. So CPP, in the event of vehicular collision, a company assigned, yeah, I'm not gonna read it. I don't have to read it all. Like whenever I'm as a reader, and I read a lot of dense stuff, I gravitate towards like philosophy and theory and conceptual stuff, which has got pages and pages of no paragraph breaks. Even being habituated towards that and being able to read that, I still like when I turn a page and I see just a full page with no breaks, I still just sigh, it's like, oh, give me a break somewhere, So on the left is exactly the same thing, but made more accessible. So for instance, instead of CPP, we have the acronym fully spelled out in the beginning. All the content on the left is represented on the right, but it's not only represented on the right once, it's represented on the right at least 2 times. So in addition to the bulleted list, we also have the infographic below that repeats the same content, but in a different form. And so here's like a kind of an implicit idea about accessibility is how many different avenues of meaning can you provide to the same content, to the same meaning, right? So in this case, we have at least 2 on the right side. We've got the bulleted list, and it tells us, hey, if your claim is approved, you get a full payment. If it's a rejected claim, you get no payment. But then on the bottom, we have the exact same information, but relayed graphically, right? Kind of comically, in fact. That car accident looks pretty funny, anyways. And the inspector, I don't know if the inspector seems like I would have chosen something different for the inspector, honestly. You want something a little bit more like nice. You don't want someone who's like looked like a detective, like Sherlock Holmes with a pipe. I don't know. But anyways, despite that, it's still like it gets across what it's saying, right? And so in terms of, we'll get back to the alt text later. Like this might be a situation in which we may not need to have an alt text because it's already been explained prior to the image, right? So we can talk about that in a little bit. Headings and subheadings. As an academic, I switched fields. I was a literary scholar for a while, and then I went into this other thing called rhetoric and writing because I wanted to be a little bit more practical. No offense to anybody who's into literary scholarship. But one of the things that I noticed in terms of the genre of different, the genre of different scholarship that I was writing was that in literary scholarship, they didn't really like to use headings and subheadings. They wanted to replicate the kind of novels they were reading, and they have an essay, which would be like a 7,000 or 10,000 word essay that has like a title and then text. Not a whole lot of subtext, not a whole lot of subheadings or headings. It's just, hey, this is our argument. We're kind of replicating the lecture. We're replicating that. It's draining, and it's hard to find your place in all of that. So on the left here, we have talking about HTML. We're not going to talk about that specifically, but we're going to use a lot of analogies between HTML and documents. On the right, though, is the exact same material, but with different headings. Visually speaking, this is formatted. We could have done this by just bumping up the text size, changing the fonts, that sort of thing. And so visually, it's accessible to us, those of us who can just read the text as this, right? Read the text visually. It's much more accessible than the prior version because of its use of negative space, breaking up different headings, using different heading titles and nesting them. So you have the first heading is an H1 heading, the second one is an H2. And so you're basically saying this content is subordinate to this content, that kind of thing. You see that visually, and then you have like the heading levels down below. That's H3, so heading 3. Now, where do you get all this? Well, in Google Docs, in Microsoft Word, even in Keynote or PowerPoint or Google Slides, you have the ability to change the text, and you ought to do so. This is the first step for accessibility, is starting with access in mind. It's much easier to start with it when you create a document, create the title, go to the formatting, the styles, and say, hey, this is a title. Tell it it's a title, and the body text can be the normal text as it says, right? But even if it says it's normal text, it's going to wreak havoc on a screen reader if it's only in normal text all the way through, right? But this is how and then on slides, for instance, using the templates on the slides, you can change the templates and the design, everything, but using the formatted slides is what will allow that slide to become accessible to a screen reader later. Because like I showed on the Markdown page with the encoding on the left and the WYSIWYG editor on the right, we need to tell that screen reader, we need to communicate and write to that screen reader to tell them what the content is. This is a title. This is a second title. This is a subtitle. This is my body text. Here's a list. Doing that manually, just with kind of visual styles, will not do that same work for the screen readers. All right, so now we have a first exercise. Don't look at that link. That link's not going to work. Jessica, would you mind? Do you have that link again? That one I sent, the last one? What you see there is a link to a Google Drive, and I have a few documents in there. One is I think it's called the principles document. I can't see it on my screen because I'm doing the screen share. Jessica, do you know what it's called?
Is it the policy on assessment and accountability position?
Yeah. So this was a document I downloaded from the CEC website, somewhere on the CEC website, and it was in PDF. And what I did was I just converted it to a Word doc. And what usually happens with a PDF or with a Word doc is that if you start with styles, if you start with it formatted and styled, when you convert it into a PDF, it will retain all of that background information. All of the encoding you do for the styles will come with it for the PDF. So if you start with your Word document with styles and formatting properly structured, when you create a PDF, it's going to be accessible right away. But if you have a PDF, a lot of times that didn't do those styles, what will happen is it won't retain all of that, or because it never was there in the first place, right? And so you've got to go in and actually correct the PDF on its own, and we'll do that in a second too. So go through for a second, and it's a short document, and think through like, what needs to be changed to make it accessible. So let me see if I can get I don't want that. So that policy document, format the heading, right? So highlight it, and whether it's in Google Doc or Microsoft Word, highlight the heading and give it a title heading, right? And then what do you got to do for that list? If a screen reader were to read that, what we'll do is it'll get to that section if it was properly formatted, and it would say list, and then it would know to like identify A, B, C as items within a list. If it's not formatted that way, a screen reader is just going to like come up to it and just say A, and then keep going. But the reader, like visually, we can see it. Oh, that's a list. And so we already know cognitively, oh, these things are all going to be parallel. They're going to be, of the same sort of set. And that does a lot of work visually for us. But if you're reading from a screen reader, you don't have that visual information coming to you. So what has to happen is that you have to format it in a certain way, so that the way the screen reader will tell the reader it's a visual format. So Jessica, yeah. So if you made the title a little larger, bold, center, a reader would still treat it as a body text. Yeah, 100%. A screen reader, even if you like switch it around, because this is what I usually do. I used to do a long time ago, right? Was just you write your document, it's all the same, and then at the end, that's when you go back and you just like highlight it, you bold it, you made it really big, right? But if you highlight it and click on heading or title, it'll do that, right? And let me see if I can. I'm going to try to share a different version, a different screen. Let me make sure I have this up. And some of this is going to be super basic for a lot of you, but some of it was news to me when I first started doing accessibility. Let me see if I can find this real quick. There we go. All right. So, oh wow, you is this all of you? Oh wow, cool. Okay. All right. So, oof, that's not good. For some reason, my one thing you can do in here is you can change the you can change your presets of what the formatted text look like. And for some reason, my formatted pretexts are bad. Like that, I don't know why that happened. That just happened this morning. But let's pretend that it doesn't look like this. That is an awful font. I would never in my right mind ever use that font for anything whatsoever. But so I changed the font, right? But you can see the title is still a title. So I can keep changing this font, whatever I want to change it into, but the title is going to stay the same. If I click over here on body text, it'll say normal text, right? This is where it gets difficult right here, because what we wanted here is a list. We wanted to format it like that and make it a list. And we could use a numbered list, right? There's a bulleted list or a numbered list. I would do this if you had a document like this and you needed to make it accessible. You might have to do a little bit of extra work, but I would come in through here and do that. And then you have to come in here and just like correct it. I mean, a lot of you know this, right? But right. So what's going to happen here then is where a screen reader wouldn't have read that as a list before, now it's going to read it as a list. And if we were to, and then here comes up title 2. I'm going to change this. Title 3. Title 3. So just like you would do in a list, you want to think through these headings. Is that title 3 or 2? That's 3. You want to think through these headings as somewhat parallel in a nested fashion too. So reference and date adopted. Well, date adopted might be, I would say 4 probably. Okay. And so, and you can change the formatting and make it look different. But what you're telling the computer is, hey, this is heading 2, this is heading 3, this is a body text. This right here is a list. Now that's the basic, this is how websites work. There's a bunch of people in chat, 1 second. Let me see. I'm gonna kind of scan the chat for a second. Constance asked a question. The default styles are huge in fonts. Yeah, I think this was just a problem when I saved this or something. Like you can change the Constance, you can change the fonts, and you can change the whole style. I don't know what kind of glitch just happened this morning when I was doing this, but for some reason, all the styles, the default styles changed. You can change your default style. Like, so for instance, whenever you open up a Word doc, it always starts now with Calibri or something, or it used to be in Times New Roman, but I don't like either of those. So I just did a different default. Yeah, so you can edit. And so Christy has a good question, comment too. Like once you format it, you could always go back through and rechange it without having to scroll through your entire document and change it. You could just change, hey, for this document, everything in H1, let's change it back to this font or this size. This is another benefit of thinking through accessibility and formatting and structuring. And yeah, Jessica, you're absolutely right. The question, if you format these, it'll generate, you can generate table of contents in Word, but also you can generate these kinds of navigation bars over here in Google Docs. And so that's what gives you that navigation by formatting it. And, oh, good question, Deanna, good question. It depends on the font, the size really, and the color contrasts, depending on, but a lot of sans serif fonts, and sans serif, for those of you who are not font nerds like myself, sans serif is basically just fonts without the little feet on there. That's literally what it means, without feet. And serif fonts are the ones like Times New Roman will have the little legs on the little feet at the bottom, a little curved out. For a lot of times, for a lot of, and some of you will probably know this much better than I do, but for a lot of folks, readers with dyslexia or any other sort of like reading disability, some of these other fonts will help facilitate a better reading experience than some others. All right, I'm gonna go back to the other slide in a second. Any other questions or comments before, as I move to the next portion?
Could you show us how to change the default so that when we open our document, it will always be the way we'd like to have it?
Give me a second. Let me see. This is going a little bit afield from accessibility. Let me see if I can do it quickly. I remember it taking me a long time before. 1 second. If I can do it within a minute, I'll do it. But if not, you can like email me afterwards and I'll walk you through it. I cannot believe
there were other comments that people said they don't use the styles because the default styles are not something, they're so off from what they would want them to be. They're different colors, they're different sizes. So I'm just asking if we could, if there's maybe one that you would suggest for accessibility would be great.
Yeah, so here you go. I did it within a minute. So I'm gonna toot my horn here. So if you go down all the way down for like Google Docs, for instance, it's a little bit more involved with Microsoft Word because everything's more involved with Microsoft Word. So for Google Docs, options, reset styles, it'll go back to my default, which is Droid Sans. But let me see. So that's one. And then you can update these over here. It'll allow you to update the defaults. Christy?
I'm just gonna come on mic real quick. I work in accessibility in higher ed. So
oh, perfect. Yeah, great.
And I work in Google Docs a lot.
Awesome.
So one of the best ways to do this in a Google Doc is to get the format, the text you want. So like the top says policy on assessment and accountability, put that into the font that you want it to be. Give it the designation of heading, well, make it a heading 1 for example, because that's probably what it would be in this document, change the font and all that kind of stuff to get it where you want, then you can right click on that text once it's highlighted. And at the bottom, you're going to see it say update title all the way down at the bottom. You can say update title to match. It's going to carry that over. And now anytime you do a title, it's going to apply those principles. And then if you have other ones in the doc, like H2s, for example, it can say update to match, and it'll apply it all the way across to all your H2s at the same time, which is really cool.
Yeah.
And I'm going to shut up now.
So let's say we wanted that to be Arial. Now, where's that?
That's
Right there.
down further.
Yeah, I don't think it's. Hold on one second. I think I'm having an issue with the Zoom. There we go. Something like that.
But this is also a .docx file, so it's not
Yeah,
actually a
yeah,
Google
true.
Doc.
Yeah,
So it's probably
Yeah.
not recognizing everything.
yeah. But it's if you just dig a little bit, you can find where you can reset the, thanks, Christy. You can find where you can reset the default styles. So like my defaults are Droid and Droid Sans. That's where I kind of like go with. It's a Google, it's a free doc. And we can talk about why that is later. I like the open font stuff. So any other questions about the doc accessibility features? I'm going back to this slide now. All right. Okay. Now, a lot of times when we like, so for instance, when we make a PDF, so in my department, we have a scanner that when I like scan a chapter from a book, it'll send me an image of a text and it won't send me text. So when I get the PDF, it's just a full, it's just a document full of images, really. I can't highlight it. I can't word search. I can't do any of those other kinds of things. Most of you probably already know how to just do the recognize text in this file. So you click that button and you wait like 5 seconds, and depending on your computer's capacity and how big the file is, it'll go through and turn and recognize all of the text. It will OCR it, I'm not even gonna be able to say it right. Optical character recognition, OCR, and it'll recognize the text as text, and that way you can you know, highlight it or word search or whatever. In this case, I used this example once because I liked it because it had like a picture of text within a picture of text, right? And so the tweet in there and everything. So when you get a PDF that wasn't made from a Word doc that was already structured, you've got to kind of do that structuring on the back end for it. And so here's a couple steps to do that. If the text in your PDF is an image and not selectable text, you convert it to text. So in Adobe, in Acrobat, go to Tools, Text Recognition in this file. That changes here and there a little bit. Sometimes it's text recognition. A number of years ago, it was called OCR, but usually it's a pretty easily findable function on there. That's great. Usually that's where people stop, though. That's where people stop with accessibility. It's just recognize the text and that's it. But as we saw with that's basically turning all the text into body text, like we saw with the Word docs. If we just use body text, then a screen reader is not going to know where to read it. And like, as you saw with this document, like where does the screen reader start? I mean, there's 2 different columns of texts. There's a title, like it might not know where to go for it. So we need to tell it where to go. So we need to add tags to indicate the heading structure. So first and foremost, we've got to say, hey, here's a heading 1, just like we did with the Word docs. We got to tell a PDF, hey, this is heading 1. Here's a heading 2. Here's a heading 3. We have to add alt text or alternative text to the images. If you're not familiar with alt text started with websites, and it wasn't even an accessibility feature to start with. It wasn't even about accessibility. It was about whether or not your computer could download the image or not. And so way back when, back with like modems and all that sort of thing, you pull up a website, you pull up some kind of web content or anything like that. Sometimes your computer couldn't download the image fast or well or at all, really. And instead of the image, you got this alternative text description, which is kind of fascinating because now it's like the mainstay for all accessibility. But it didn't start that way. So we'll add those, but I have a whole section on that here in a second. So there you would just, and this, you can do this in Word docs too, is right click and or slides or PDFs, right click and then add alt text. And again, we'll talk about that in a second. Set reading order. Here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. You've got to actually go through and say, as a sighted reader who is like making this to PDF accessible, you've got to go through and tell the screen reader how to read this document. And you got to set the language to whatever language the primary language is. So again, here's our document. It's a document, it's a chapter from a book. So there's a lot of information going on here. There's the 3, that's important to locate where we are in the book. It's chapter 3. There's a title, there's a subtitle. So screenshot is the title of this chapter. The subtitle, the photographic witnessing of digital worlds. We've got 2 columns of text. We've got up here, we have a page number. We have a header 2, and we have an image of text with lots of information in there. We've got the user's name. We've got the content. We've got social media info here. We've got a figure, description, caption. I'm sorry. So there's a lot of things to do here. Now, if you were going to screenshot or do this in Acrobat, and I'm hoping some of you have Acrobat because our next exercise is going to be doing this, just that. You have to go through and assign the reading order. So in the current Acrobat update, you go through and you click on accessibility, the accessibility tools, and then you'll be given a big list. One is recognize text. One is setting language. There's a few other ones, but one is setting the reading order. Now, what will happen is it will either automatically recognize some boxes, and sometimes those recognitions are just bad. They're not good. So you got to go in there and do it manually. But I usually just create a box. So you just like basically click and drag. And as you can see here, I didn't give that as a number. I should have. I click that and I put 1 because that's telling the screen reader to read this first. But in addition to that, I click that and that's the first one. It'll just pop up whatever box I draw first will draw. And then I come over here and I hit heading 1. Over here, same thing. I highlight that text, I draw a box around it, and it turns it kind of gray like that. And it'll assign it 2 because that's the second text the text reader will read. And then I'll just say text or paragraph. Notice there's no normal here. That's what I like about this. There's no normal, so we don't have to even worry about that. Same over here, over here. So as you can see, there's like different levels of information going on here that you can do. So second exercise. There's another document in the file. This one is the one that, let's say Jessica sent me an image, or actually, let's say Jessica used an image for this event on Twitter, and let's just pretend that that image didn't have any text recognized or anything. And if we want to make that text into a PDF, it would first start as just an image, a PNG file. Now we create it into a PDF, and it's still going to be an image. So there's a, Jessica, do you know the name of that file?
It's DLD webinar, October 2021.
Cool, thank you. So if you can, download that DLD webinar, October 21 PDF, and open it up. Like, first of all, what do you see as a PDF? It's probably gonna open up in your browser first. So you can just download it to your desktop and open it from your downloads. Like, what's the problem here with this as in terms of accessibility?
There's no text at all. I can't even highlight text.
Yeah.
Somewhere.
Yeah, you can't even highlight it, right? And this is, I mean, this is exactly what happens with infographics as well. So this lesson right here we're learning is exactly what's going on with infographics too. Even if this is text or image, it's still an image. And so you've got to first recognize the text. So if you have Adobe Acrobat and not just the reader version, select text recognition, recognize text, and run that on this page. It's just one page, so it shouldn't take but a second. And it should recognize the text within the thing. Yeah, Dave, exactly. You can't highlight the text because it's just all an image. It's just an image of a text, and it's not actual text to be able to work with or highlight or word search or anything. And certainly you wouldn't be able to get a screen reader to read it. It would just say image, and it would say the title of the file of image rather than anything else, which is another good reason to title your file something that can be read by a screen reader as well. So see if you can do that. See if you can click on accessibility if you have that feature on your Adobe, and give it a go for a second to see about highlighting a section and determining which word order you need to work from. This is, as a side note, if some of you might be experiencing this problem, if you don't have, it's really difficult to take a PDF, because Adobe's platform is really good about this. It's like it's the standard for all of this kind of stuff, but there's very few other PDF programs that have as robust of an accessibility tool set that Adobe does. And so there's a problem of a different kind of accessibility altogether there. If you don't have a subscription to Adobe or don't have the current build of it, taking a PDF that's already been made and it's not accessible and making it accessible is a difficult thing to do, because the platform itself can be expensive and can be cost prohibitive. So is anybody able to recognize the text in that image and also create some reading order?
I can a little bit, but it's messy.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough to, like, this one's a tough one, right? This is where if you're designing for accessibility, it changes how you design the first thing to begin with, right? If you can't design something that's going to be accessible, then you need to design it to where it can be accessible at a certain point, right? For this one, you can, again, you could create alt text, and it's kind of a workaround, right? So if you really wanted to, and we'll get to that in a second, and Christy's right, you're going to need Adobe Pro DC to do a lot of that kind of work. And that's a problem for accessibility, I think. But you could do, like, in a second, we're going to talk about alt text as a way to describe images. And some alt text programs like Adobe will allow you to put a lot into that box. And you can get by with taking the text and putting a lot of that in the box itself of alt text. And that way it'll just read the alt text and read all the relevant information from that image. But you can create, you can work with it and create a readable PDF from there. Any other questions or comments about PDFs before we move on to alt description?
I put something in the chat. This is Jessica McQueston. What happens when you scan kind of a book or a chapter or something, and then you go and convert it to recognizable text, and it just adds a bunch of characters, or it, is just really funky looking. And it's just like, it looks nothing like the original source.
Yeah, sometimes.
Any advice?
Yeah, so, like, number one, it's always going to be, I would, when you scan, most of the scanners that we have in our department and in our offices and stuff, they scan at a very low DPI. So dots per inch or whatever, right? And they scan at a very low DPI, which means resolution more or less. The higher scan you can give it, the better able the program will be able to read the text. If the text isn't super clear, or if it's not super, well, there's two problems here. One is clarity of scan. The initial scan has to be super clear or as clear as possible for the OCR to work well. Okay. The other problem is sometimes you download text and there's like permission issues with the text and behind it, the encoding behind it. So I know I've downloaded a lot of, like, let's say articles from journals that are like locked up behind 4 or 5 different paywalls and all that kind of stuff, right? And I'll go to highlight some text because I want to do a block quote or something. And when you highlight it and you bring it over, the characters are just gobbledygook. They're not even English or any language. They're just like wingdings or something. And a lot of that is just proprietary. It's scrambled the actual text behind it, and so it's rendered it completely inaccessible, but also honestly a lot very unusable too. So I think maybe the first question was maybe make the scan more clear and make sure it's got a higher DPI. And then the second part would be sometimes you have to get a new PDF.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, Jessica, good question. For those of you who are ad hoc designers using Canva, is there a way to create and save download files to make them readable? There should be in Canva. I've only used Canva a few times. I usually use InDesign and a few other documents. If someone else knows Canva really well and knows the answer to this question, please jump up. But you should be able to, oh, Christy knows. What's up, Christy?
Sorry. Not from my experience, because depending on the type of format you start with, you'll likely still need to do the steps, because like Casey was mentioning, when you're making a graphic, if it has text in it, it's basically an infographic, and that text isn't going to come over in some way. So that's why alt text and recognizing text and all that kind of stuff is really important.
Yeah, so man, it's kind of like I was saying a second ago with, like, if you have, because the graphic that we're using for exercise here, I just made sure I didn't have any text in there to use as an example, right? But it's a straight PNG. It might be able to recognize a lot of the text, but because some of the text is like kind of script based or script-ish, like handwritten a little bit, sometimes it doesn't read it that well. So using alt text and just basically right clicking and making sure you can add alt text in there. And that's where we're going next. So thanks for that question, Jessica. We're going there now. All right, so alt text. Alt text, as I said earlier, is basically the description of an image for screen readers or technological situations where the computer can't download an image. And so instead, it'll just have an alternative text description in its place, alternative to the image, right? And so here's an example I like to use. I'm going to ask you all to provide an alt text description for this in a second, but we won't start there. I'm just previewing the information for you. A long time ago, the American Museum of Natural History had this like alt text hackathon where they had all of these images in its archive for this digital archive. And it was inviting people to come in and describe those images for them, right? It was a super good exercise and event, and it went on for about a year. And I used it in a lot of my classes, and that's why I still have this image today, because this was one of the training images. With alt text, there's a couple things you want to understand about alt text. Let me see if I can. It should typically be accurate and equivalent in presenting the same content and function as presented by the image. So it's not just about, hey, these are two bears, but how does it fit into the context of what's being said on that page, right? So if it's a infographic, like the one we saw earlier with the insurance claims, if you want to describe that image, you wanted to relate it to what's going on before. It'd be kind of out of place if you just described it by itself. So be accurate and equivalent in presenting the same content. Be succinct. Usually you don't want to go too far. About 150 characters is adequate for most alt text. Now, there are some different schools of thought here. There's a really great, if you're really interested in checking this out, there's a great sort of movement of thinking about alt text as poetry. So if an image is being given to like create a mood or set a tone, the alt text shouldn't just be like bland and just added on, right? It should also try to mimic the function of that image. So if the function of that image is to provide a mood or to set a tone, then maybe the alt description should also do so. But that's a lot of like regular sort of, not regular, but the typical sort of boundaries of alt text is succinct and concise. Don't be redundant. So if the text above the image is talking about bears or Alaskan bears or whatever, you don't want to just repeat that again, unless there's a sort of need to. So be cognizant about where the image is taking place and where it's at. Finally, don't use the image like phrases like image of or picture of, because when a screen reader will read that, it'll automatically say image. And so if it says image of, it's just like additional extra information that doesn't need to be said. This was like the hardest thing for me to learn not to do. This is a picture, like you're describing, this is a picture of a bear or whatever. So it was like a little bit difficult for me to break that habit, but you don't have to describe it, or you don't have to say image of, because they already know it's that. So for instance, here's a good example. And a lot of times, a lot of our platforms now are really good about recognizing some images. So here's a great picture. It's, I'll ask, or we'll look at a couple different examples of how to describe this. Here's how my slide deck wanted to describe this when I built this slide deck. When you say generate a description for me, this is what it says: a dog on a yellow inner tube. That's pretty good. That's pretty surprising how good that is, honestly. Although the problem is it is a dog and there's yellow in there, but there's like, what else? Like, it's not an inner tube. It's a kayak at best, or it's a kayak, right? Specifically. But as a sort of generative description, that's automatic. That's pretty solid. And we'll talk about social media in a second. Facebook typically tries to generate descriptions for every image, and you have to like kind of dig in to describe the image, but that's we'll talk about that in a second. Here's, according to the principles we talked about, here's how you could describe it. A poor description is just saying this is a dog. It's fine, it'll work. It's not very good. A fair description is a dog on a boat. Concision and precision doesn't necessarily need to have few. You can still get 150 characters in there and still be precise and specific. So the great alt text would be small French dog. What does that say? Alone on a kayak in water. So this is a much better description that allows the image and the function of the image. It's kind of funny, right? It's just a dog by itself on a boat. That description allows that to happen. So again, be accurate, be succinct, don't be redundant, don't use things like images of or graphic of, and try to keep it to around 150 characters. So we're going to be back at the bears. If this was a Word doc, this is how we would do it. We would have our bears in our Word doc, and we would just click on the image and right click, and amongst the drop-down boxes, it'll say edit alt text. Now, when you edit alt text in an image in a Word doc and you convert it to a PDF later, it's going to still, just like the formatting, it's going to retain all that information in there for you. Slides, same exact way. I showed you a second ago, it auto-generated. So how would you describe this? You can put a quick description in the chat if you want. Give it a go. All right, Addie, thank you. 2 Alaskan brown bears. One is on 2 legs, one is on 4 legs. A small lake and snow-capped mountain is in background. Oh, that's really good. That's really good. When I use this one in classes a lot too. And what usually happens, and no one's gonna make this mistake now because Addie came through for us. Yeah, 2 bears. One is standing on 2 legs and looking toward the viewer. Oh, great. These are great. One standing all 4 ways. You all are like the first ever workshop who didn't do this. Usually what happens is they say one is standing. That's it. They don't say like on 2 legs or anything like that. And it's like, well, no, they're both standing. They're just standing differently, right? Because again, this is where we get into that, the idea of normal, like, oh, the one bear is standing because that's how I stand. And then, yeah. Now, these are great examples. These are good. Yeah, and as Christy said, to repeat again, we want to make sure the context is good. And so this one's kind of unfair because it's out of the context from the website that was in there. But here's how it's described on the actual website. 2 brown, and what you miss out on here is the diorama business, because you can't tell that's a diorama from the image alone. So that's the only thing you missed out on, anybody missed out on. But a couple of these descriptions are even better than this one, right? That talk about the mountains. I think the mountains are pretty important, but they are not in the actual image description of the actual website. So this is how it appears in the actual website. So we're going to skip this part because I've already, we've kind of just did that. But if we were going to use different documents and stuff, I would have had you pull up a document and tag those in an actual, whatchamacallit. But at some point in the next day or two, get a document out and try it on a slide deck or a Word doc or a PDF, adding an alt text to it. Here is the last little section I wanted to show you is social media. So I'm going to use, again, the image that that Jessica gave me or that Jessica used on to promote this on Twitter. I'm going to show you how to add the alt text on Twitter. So I recorded this morning to show you all. So here we go. I'm going to go to image. I'm going to add the JPEG on here. And so that's the image file. And what I want to do is I want to go down to, and it's an image. So there's no text there. So I'm going to add description. And up there, you can see alt, or you can edit the photo, but I'm going to do the alt text. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to first go through and add in the most important information to make sure that the most important information is in the alt text. You get 1,000 characters on Twitter to add alt text. Now, if this was a regular image of a dog on a boat, for instance, we wouldn't need 1,000 characters. We would just want to have 150 or 100 or whatever. But because this is an image of a flyer of a text, we want to add a lot more than just that. So I'm writing some of the relevant information in the alt text itself. So I basically do the title, I do the date and time. I should have put CST, but didn't. Free webinar hosted by CEC's division, learning disabilities. And I'm going to spell things wrong because I do. There we go. Register. Now, one thing you want to, I'm not certain. I know this when Twitter first added alt text as an ability you can do as a user, you had to go into your settings and turn it on, and actually turn it on. So if you go to try to post something and it doesn't have an alt text description option for you, it's because you just have to go into settings and turn on that function to allow you to do that. Then it will go back and allow you to do that for every image you do. It'll allow you to put in alt text. And then I'll correct these or whatever.
So is this just read as text, or does it say flyer with this information?
Yeah, it'll just read the text. It'll say image, and then it'll go to the alt text description.
Okay, so you can include everything pretty much in it, essentially, that you want them to have. Thank
Yeah,
you.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, but you can already see, like, there's so much information I didn't put in here, right? I only used up 230 characters, but there's, 700 or so left to go. I didn't put a whole lot in there. And this is where we would rethink maybe our design a little bit. If there was too much information, I couldn't put it into an alt text for this platform, then I might redesign this for this platform, right? And then I post it, and if you can get down C, it'll say alt text down below on the bottom left, sorry. And there's actually, I had an image, I had a video before, I lost it before I started this. There's a couple of Twitter bots, like automated Twitter accounts, where you can go to an image and you can you can just say alt text description. I can't remember the name of it. That's not the name, but something like that. And then the bot will go through and read the alt text for you and print out the alt text as a reply. I had an image of that before, but I don't have it here. Here is this Twitter again? Oh, oops. I was going to show you Instagram. Instagram has the same thing. Oh, yeah, here's Instagram. Here we go. This one's a little quicker. So I add this image, and you could scroll through. It's not in the filters or anything like that. What you want to do is you want to go down to where it says edit and click on edit. And then it'll have a bunch of different things. Oh, wait, there we go. Go down to advanced settings, accessibility down below. Click on write alt text. And this one's a really tough one to work because it only gives you a little narrow window to write in. And so where Twitter gave you 1,000 characters, I don't even know how many characters this one gives me. It just gives me a little tiny window to write in. So it's kind of difficult to work with, but it's still there. So that's for Twitter. I'm not on Facebook, so I can't show you Facebook's, but basically with Facebook's, what happens is when you post an image, it doesn't give you that quick, if I remember right, the last time I looked at it was a couple of months ago, but it doesn't give you a quick edit button like this Instagram does or Twitter does. You have to post the image and then click on it afterwards and edit the image after you've posted it. And what you'll see is it generated it will have generated an auto description, which is about as good or bad as others, as the slide deck I showed with the dog. Oh, Stephanie, good question. Jessica, you're right. I don't have familiar with Qualtrics as much. I think that if you use, Stephanie, do you mean just like the text itself or any images within the text or?
Mainly just text.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not really using any images per se, but I mean, that might be good to learn as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, mainly text.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think Qualtrics is really good about structuring their data, right? So it's very clear, like question 1, question 2, question 3, and all of the responses are all extremely structured. So when you build a survey, it's like multiple choice. The formatting is just like out of the box formatted as you go. So I think it's pretty accessible along those lines. And that's where we get usability and accessibility that's beyond your control, to be honest with you. In terms of like what you can select and where, you can't really move around the multiple choice and all that stuff, but it's pretty standard. So I think screen readers are pretty well adjusted to things like Qualtrics or things, SurveyMonkey, things like that, because it's already so structured. I think it's going to be fine.
Excellent. Thank you. That's good to know. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Jessica?
Yeah, I had a question. So one of the things that I have seen on social media is a lot of people maybe not using the like official alt text
Yeah.
and just putting like image description and then doing that. Can you maybe speak to that a little bit, if one's better than the other, or?
Yeah, I prefer, and there's a couple camps breaking out about this. I prefer to use, so for the longest time, these social media platforms didn't have the ability to do the alt description, and people clamored for them. Access and disability scholars and advocates clamored for this ability to add these things in there. And it took them a long time, those platforms, but they finally did it. In the meantime, people started developing habits of just doing it for themselves, and they got into the habit of doing so. And so much to the extent now where even with that ability, I think a lot of people think that making it visible is important for accessibility. I am in a different camp. I think if you have this structure that allowed you to do this, and this is what it's for, you use it, because otherwise what's going to happen is that it's going to read extra information. It's going to say image, and then it's not going to have a description, and then it'll say image of, and then do that, right? And so what I think my personal sort of, my personal take is that I think it's trying to speak to two different audiences at the same time. And I think it might overlap and confuse some things. So speaking to sighted audiences to make this practice visible is an important, necessary thing to do. But I think for the experience of those posts, the actual experience of the screen readers, it's going to have some information in there. It's going to be gobbled, you know. It's almost as if you were saying, oh yeah, image of blah, 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 you know. So I think it's a good impulse to try to write the descriptions, but I also think that yeah, no worries. Like, yeah, this is just a bonus exercise if no one wants to do it. I just wanted to give some attention to Jessica and her organization, so, and y'all. But I also think what happens in a lot of those images, those descriptions, is that the person gets overly descriptive and I've seen paragraphs of descriptions where they go into like their history and identities and all of this stuff in the description. And this it's no longer describing than it is like implying certain things. So there's really a large spectrum of those kinds of usabilities. Any other questions about alt text or social media on alt text? So we started with the takeaways. We're going to end with the takeaways. And we got some questions. I got a couple recommendations for you all, but also we can go into any general questions. But like I said before, disabilities mismatch between a person and their environment. All text, even documents, have to have some sort of accessible component to them. We have to tell them how to do it. This also refers to our Canvas pages, for instance, for students or you know, learning management systems. Creating a page in Canvas, it's very helpful to add those headings in there as well to structure it all kinds of ways. And finally, accessibility makes things better for everyone. It refers not to only the content, but also the structure of it as well. Here's some additional resources. Here's some of the sources that I often like return to for whatchamacallit, for, hello? Can you hear me, Jessica?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Your video froze for 1 sec, but you're.
Okay. I had a panic moment because, yeah. So, so this is a slide I always use for these, because these are the texts that I use regularly and often. Mismatch we talked about before. Reading sounds is all about captioning. We didn't talk about captioning much, but this book is a really fascinating book, and its online website's even better, talking about the limits of captioning. What Can a Body Do is just an absolutely amazing book. It came out last year. Sarah Hendren is the designer who thinks about accessibility and critical design. Building Access is a really great book about the history of universal design. And then, of course, Web for Everyone is a great resource for if you're doing, I didn't talk about web accessibility much at all today, but if you're talking about that, it's really good for that. So if anybody has any questions or comments?
This was really helpful. Thank you so much.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thank you. If you look in that Google Drive I shared, you're welcome to all of those documents, but there's also a, I tried to import it into the slides. And I couldn't put it in slides because every time I try to put it in the slides, the automatic text, alt text generator would try to read it and it crashed the slides. And I kept losing all the slides I had in there. And I was kind of like when I just jumped on the call before you all got here and I was with Jessica, I was like, oh, I lost these slides. But there's a checklist in there I designed for you all. And you're welcome to print that out or change it. I put CEC on the bottom, but I'm happy to go and change it to what's the
DLD. Yeah.
Thank you, DLD. Sorry, I'm happy to change it to that if you'd prefer that. But yeah, you're welcome to that and use that however you'd like to. So
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Casey. This was really helpful. I know there were things that I thought I was like, oh, I know all about the Word doc part. That will be easy. And then I'm like, oh, I actually did not know most of what you're doing. So this was extremely helpful. And for those of you who are on here, or if you know anyone else who is interested, we will share a recording of this webinar. I will send out an email to everyone who registered, and it will also be available on the DLD website.
Thanks, Jessica, and everyone else for coming, and DLD for hosting us. It's always good to talk about accessibility, and I appreciate it. And you all are all welcome to follow up after with me if you have any questions or comments you want to say afterwards. So just find me on the interwebs, and I'm happy to chat further.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Casey. And thank you everyone for joining us on this Friday. Have a great weekend.